Welcome, dear dreamer, to another journey through the whispers of time. Before we drift together into this tale, let me kindly invite you to subscribe to Mythos Lullaby, where ancient legends are retold not with thunder, but with gentle echoes meant to guide you into rest. Tonight, we follow the path of a man whose story was carved into both history and myth, the Roman general turned gladiator Maximilianus. His life was fire and betrayal, steel and blood, yet within it also lay silence, longing, and the eternal dream of home. Let us walk slowly through the ruins of his memory and hear the echo of his name in the wind.
The story begins in the cold forests of the north, far from the marble columns of Rome, far from the golden sunlight of the Mediterranean. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the earth was damp with winter's breath. The Roman legions camped among the trees, their tents a sea of pale cloth, their fires glowing like scattered stars against the dark forest floor. At the center of this frozen silence stood Maximilianus, a general not born of luxury, but of discipline and faith. His armor did not gleam like a king's ornament, but carried the dents of battles past. His men loved him, not for words, but for the quiet certainty that wherever he walked, victory seemed to follow. The morning was still. Frost clung to the grass, and the mist rose like a ghost from the ground. Soldiers sharpened their swords with slow, deliberate strokes, the sound like whispers of stone against steel. Horses stamped their hooves, their breath visible in the cold. The forest stretched endlessly around them, shadows layered upon shadows.
Maximilianus walked among his men. He did not speak of glory nor of conquest. Instead, he spoke of home. He told them that beyond the smoke of battle there were vineyards waiting, fields golden with wheat, and the laughter of children by the hearth. He gave them not visions of empire, but of peace. And so his men stood taller, their hearts warmed against the cold. Then came the signal. A horn sounded, low and steady, like the call of destiny itself. The legions formed into lines, shields locking, spears angled. The forest beyond was not silent. The enemy stirred in its shadows, fierce tribes defending their home. Yet Maximilianus raised his sword not as a butcher, but as one who knew the weight of every life taken. The battle began not with thunder, but with silence breaking. Arrows whistled, swords clashed, shields shook. The forest itself seemed to groan with the weight of violence. Yet Maximilianus moved like a steady flame in the storm. His commands were calm, his eyes unwavering. Where he walked, his men held the line.
And when the clash ended, when the shouts faded into the rustle of wind through broken branches, the Romans stood victorious. The field was silent once more, the earth damp now with more than frost. Maximilianus removed his helmet, his breath slow, his eyes distant. He did not smile at victory, for in his heart every triumph was only another step away from the soil of home he longed to touch again. That night, the campfires burned brighter. Soldiers sang softly, drinking from cups passed hand to hand, but Maximilianus sat apart, staring into the flames. In the crackle of firewood, he saw vineyards swaying in summer winds. In the sparks, he saw his son's laughter. And though the night was cold, his heart warmed itself with memory. He was a man of Rome, yes, but more than that, he was a man of family, of roots sunk deep in the earth. He fought not for emperors, but for the promise of one day returning to the simple life, to the silence of fields, to the scent of earth after rain. The North had given him victory, but his soul belonged to the South, to the land where his heart waited.
The northern winds carried whispers of victory back to Rome, and with them the name of Maximilianus rose like incense before the altars of power. In the city, senators spoke his name with reluctant respect. In the barracks, soldiers sang it with devotion, and in the palace, the old emperor carried it in the secret chamber of his heart. For the emperor was a man at the edge of time. His hair, once dark as olive wood, now shone like silver threads under the sun. His eyes, though tired, held still the clarity of one who had seen the empire at its height and at its wounds. He had ruled not only with power, but with thought, weaving Rome together with both sword and law. Yet he knew, as all men must, that his days were numbered. It was in the great camp of the northern forests that he sought Maximilianus. The emperor arrived not in golden splendor, but cloaked in wool against the cold, riding among his guards, the breath of their horses rising like smoke. When he entered the tent of the general, the soldiers stood straighter, for though their emperor was frail, his presence filled the space like a hymn.
Maximilianus knelt, but the emperor raised him swiftly, placing a hand upon his shoulder. "You are Rome," he said, his voice soft yet heavy as stone. "Not the marble, nor the Senate, nor the golden statues, but you. The fields you long for, the family you love, the discipline you breathe, that is Rome." The words struck Maximilianus not with pride, but with the ache of truth. For he did not crave empire, he craved only to protect it, so that he might one day return to his vineyard in peace. The emperor, weary with age, spoke of the future. "My time is closing, like a candle burning low. Rome will need a guardian, not a tyrant. My son is eager for the throne, but he carries hunger in his heart, not wisdom. I would have you stand as protector until Rome learns again the meaning of honor." Maximilianus bowed his head, silence his only answer. He was a soldier. His duty was obedience, not ambition. Yet in the words of the emperor, he felt the weight of a crown, heavier than any helmet. That night, under a sky veiled in mist, the emperor summoned him once more. They walked together through the forest, where the torches glowed like fallen stars. The old man spoke of Rome as though she were a woman he had loved all his life, beautiful, fierce, and fragile. He confessed his fear that she would be torn apart by greed when his breath failed. And then, with a sigh that seemed to carry centuries, he named Maximilianus his heir, not in title, not in blood, but in spirit.
"You will not be emperor," he whispered, "but you will be Rome's hope." In the silence that followed, only the wind replied, rustling through the pines like the voice of the gods. But there, hidden beyond the torchlight, another pair of ears listened. The sun, shadowed in jealousy, felt the words pierce him like daggers. Rage burned in him, hotter than the fires of the camp. If his father would deny him, then the father would not live to see another dawn. Thus, destiny bent its course. For what was spoken in trust under the cold northern stars would be drowned by betrayal before the sun next rose.
The dawn that followed seemed gentler than the night that preceded it. A pale light spread across the northern sky, brushing the forest with silver. The soldiers stirred in their tents, unaware that history itself was shifting in the shadows. The emperor lay in his chamber, his breath shallow, his body wrapped in heavy furs against the morning chill. His mind, however, remained sharp, still echoing with the words he had spoken to Maximilianus, words of trust, of hope, of a Rome reborn through honor rather than ambition. But outside that chamber stood the emperor's son, cloaked not in devotion, but in envy. His eyes, dark and restless, glowed with the fever of betrayal. All his life he had walked behind the shadow of greatness, waiting for the crown that seemed his by blood, not by merit. And now, in the stillness of this fragile dawn, he resolved that his inheritance would not be stolen. He entered the tent with silent steps, the guards bowing, unaware of the storm he carried. He approached the bed where his father lay. The emperor's tired eyes opened, and for a moment they softened. He reached out a trembling hand, as though to bless his son, perhaps even to forgive the flaws he bore.
But forgiveness was not what the son sought. His arms closed around the frail body, not in love, but in suffocation. The old man struggled only briefly, for age had already loosened his grip on life. His last breath left him not with rage, but with sorrow, as though even in death he mourned what Rome would now become. The camp awoke to the news. The emperor had passed quietly in the night. Morning spread like a shadow, yet in the palace tent the sun wasted no time. Draped in purple, he declared himself ruler. His words were honeyed, but his eyes burned with fire. He spoke of strength, of destiny, of a Rome that would bow to his will. Maximilianus entered, his armor still dusted with frost. He knelt in grief, for he had loved the emperor as both sovereign and father. But when his eyes met the new rulers, he saw not grief, but hunger. And in that moment, the path ahead became clear. Later, in a private chamber, the son spoke to him. His voice was calm, almost tender. "He served my father well. Now you will serve me. Together, we will shape Rome to our desire." But Maximilianus, steady as stone, shook his head. "I serve Rome, not the hunger of one man." Those words sealed his fate. That night, the order was given. Maximilianus was to be taken, bound, and erased. His family, too, would not be spared, for the new ruler feared not only his sword, but his legacy. Soldiers loyal to the throne carried out the command with silent cruelty. Maximilianus fought not for his life, but for a glimpse of his wife and son one last time. He returned to his villa only to find fire where once there was laughter. The vineyards burned, the house lay in ash, and the silence of loss struck deeper than any blade. He was seized, beaten, and carried away, his wrists shackled. The land that had once sung to him now echoed only with grief. The general of Rome, victor of countless battles, protector of legions, was cast into chains. He was sold like an animal, his name reduced to whispers. The empire he had served with honor turned its back upon him, swallowing his story in the roar of the new reign. But within him, though beaten and broken, a flame remained, not of vengeance, not yet, but of memory. For in his heart he still walked through vineyards under golden sun, still heard his son's laughter carried by the wind. And so, in chains, Maximilianus was led away from the world he had known, toward a destiny neither crown nor conqueror could have foreseen. The sands of the arena.
The road south unspooled beneath their feet in a gray ribbon, dust rising in sighs that settled on skin and memory alike. Shackles chimed a dull, repetitive music, iron speaking to iron, while the guards kept a pace that considered neither grief nor fatigue. Between olive groves grown winter thin and fields caught in the pause between harvests, the column moved as a small storm moves, noticed, endured, soon forgotten by those not standing inside it. Maximilianus walked without pleading. His wrists bore the weight as though it were a lesson rather than a sentence. The cold of iron sought his bones and found only discipline. The ache in his shoulders found only breath, shaped and reshaped until it obeyed. He did not haggle with fate, nor blame the road. He counted steps not to measure distance, but to keep his mind from wandering into flames that could no longer be undone. At night they stopped where the land agreed to shelter them, a stand of cypress, a ruined milestone, the lee of a hill. Fires were lit for the guards, none for the chained. Stars made their quiet inventory of men and choices. Sleep arrived like an animal that will not come when called, but settles nearby if left unbothered. In those hours, while others surrendered to exhaustion, Maximilianus listened, to leather settling, to a horse cropping dry grass, to a night insect tuning its small instrument, and let each sound be proof that the world, indifferent yet intact, still contained rooms where rage could not enter.
Morning returned, as it always does for those who have nothing left to expect from it. Villagers blinked their windows open. A baker's door breathed out a warm sweetness the chained could not taste. Children watched, then remembered a chore and disappeared. An old woman crossed herself in a language older than the empire and set a cup of water at the ditch's edge where a guard might notice it and not ask who had placed it there. Little mercies wore no banners, but they remembered their work. Days later, the column reached a market on the rim of a small desert. Dust light as pollen, sun bright but tired. Traders there had learned to appraise men with the same calm they brought to mules and amphorae. A crier's voice rose and fell, announcing lots, 2 field hands from the coast, a pair of brothers with the look of fishermen and the wrists of ropemen, and, set slightly apart, as though the sun itself had placed a finger on him, 1 soldier, scarred and steady, suitable for games. No one asked his name. New names would be given as casually as new sandals. Exchange was swift. Coin touching palm, palm touching parchment. Ink scratching conclusions into a ledger that would outlast memory. The man who bought him was neither cruel nor kind. He had the eyes of someone who keeps accounts and sleeps untroubled because the columns add up. He ran a school in the sands, where men were unmade and remade until the crowd learned to love them.
The journey there was shorter, but the air changed its grammar. Heat spoke in long vowels. Wind carried old stories of caravans and oases, of bone and bread, of men who had bargained with the horizon and paid in thirst. The school appeared as a scatter of low walls around a ring of sand, as if a palm had pressed its heel into the desert and then decided to call that hollow a destiny. They cut the shackles and replaced them with rules. A foreman read them aloud as though reading a prayer. Dawn wake, water ration, drill, bread, drill, oil the leather, drill. Silence at sundown except for the licensed singers of sorrow, who kept their voices low and their lyrics simpler than grief. Punishments were described without heat, rewards without promise. The men nodded, not in agreement, but because nodding conserved energy. The dormitory was cool by courtesy of thick walls and narrow windows. 100 breaths learned to share a room. Straw whispered under tired backs. Somewhere a man prayed to gods with regional addresses. Somewhere else another man made a careful knot and untied it and made it again, as if fingers could become a plan. In the yard, weapons lay in rows like alphabet pieces waiting to be arranged. Swords that had no stories yet, spears eager to learn distance, nets folded into obedience, tridents holding their 3 teeth as politely as possible. A trainer, broad, scarred, not young, picked up a wooden blade and struck the sand with it as a teacher strikes a desk to clarify where attention belongs.
"You are not here to die," he said without shouting. "Not quickly. You are here to be read. The crowd will read your fear if you carry it in the wrong hand. They will read your rage if you let it do the speaking. They will read your breath. Keep the breath steady, and the sentence will make sense." He looked from face to face and found in Maximilianus not defiance, not supplication, but a quiet that had been polished by years of weather. "You," he said. "Soldier?" "Once," Maximilianus answered. "Good. Forget most of it. Remember the rest." Training began as all long labors begin, not with thunder, but with repetition. Feet learned a new ground, sand that betrayed balance, that swallowed speed, that taught humility by the handful. Shoulders learned the weight of shields shaped differently than legion's discipline. Hands learned to hold without clenching, to strike without announcing. Men learned partners, their timing, their temper, learned the sun, the hour to respect it and the hour to lean into it, learned themselves, the part that wanted to run and the part that, surprisingly, did not. Maximilianus took each lesson as if it were a seed. He planted it without commentary, returned to water it with sweat, accepted that not all would grow at the same rate. When he fell, he memorized the falling. When he rose, he memorized the rising. Some men looked for the eye of the trainer, he looked for the edge of breath. He learned that a half step back is sometimes the shortest path forward. He learned that the sand keeps secrets if you treat it like a witness instead of a stage.
At night,
Oil lamps made small suns in niches along the wall. Men traced scars with their eyes and let them be scripture. The school had a physician whose hands were gentle in the way of men who have learned that tenderness is efficient. He stitched, he set, he pressed cool cloth to the fevered. "Save your rage for waking," he would say, which in that place meant both mercy and strategy. Not all lessons came with blades. In a corner of the yard stood an old gladiator, retired by decree of the joints. He swept sand as though sweeping a temple. When the day's grinding was done, a few men lingered near him to borrow another kind of knowledge. He spoke without myth, without bravado. "The crowd," he said, drawing with the broom a circle that was every arena, and this one too, "is a tide. You cannot order it, you can feel it. Do something honest and it may carry you. Do something beautiful and it may forgive you. Do something cruel and it will leave a mark on you that even victory cannot remove. Decide what marks you wish to wear." Maximilianus listened. He did not ask for shortcuts. He asked, once, about fear. "Fear is a good student if you make it sit in front and take notes. If you send it to the back of the class, it throws stones."
Weeks became a calendar the sand understood. New men arrived with eyes still noisy from loss. Others left, some upright, awarded a ring of laurel woven from a trainer's patience. Some feet first, the sand gathering into their outlines before the wind was done speaking. Stories began to attach themselves to Maximilianus, as stories do to anyone who continues to exist where disappearance is common. He did not collect them. He allowed them to pass, as weather passes across a field that remains itself. In the middle week of a hot month, the master of the school walked the line with a buyer from a provincial town. Contracts had language tight as a fist. Names were measured against coin, potential against appetite. When they stopped before Maximilianus, the buyer's gaze lingered, not at the shoulders or scars, but at the quiet between his breaths. "That one," he said. "No," the master replied simply, and the buyer, calculating without offense, moved on. Days later, a courier arrived bearing orders stamped with a seal that smelled of Rome. The capital's games demanded new blood. The school was to prepare a cohort for the road, men who could open a festival with competence and, with luck, close it with a story. There were cheers from some, as men cheer when a lottery chooses numbers they have already given up on. Others went silent. Maximilianus looked toward the horizon he had not chosen and bowed his head as one bows before a mountain, not in worship, but in acknowledgement of scale.
Travel back toward the city turned the desert's sentence into clauses. Vineyards resumed their punctuation. Villages inserted their parenthetical markets. At a crossroads shrine, the trainer touched the lintel and almost shyly asked whatever listened there to be kind. The men walked into their future with their sandals saying what sandals always say: keep going. They reached the city at dawn, which is the only hour when marble remembers how to be modest. Arches yawned and then tightened. Streets inhaled them, exhaled them into courtyards where fountains spoke in a dialect of light. Above all rose the amphitheater, rings upon rings of stone, each arch and opened eye. Even the men who had sworn never to be impressed were impressed. The old gladiator,
who had traveled with them because the school did not trust the city's surgeons, rested his hand briefly on Maximilianus's shoulder. No speech, just wait. It helped. They were led beneath the great building through corridors that smelled of oil, iron, straw, and old triumph. Cells received them without comment. In the half-light, other faces watched, a fraternity of the unwilling and the remade. A man with the tattoos of the Rhine tribes nodded from a bench. Another, lean as a sparrow, sat cross-legged and hummed under his breath. A pair were playing at knucklebones with a seriousness that suggested the stakes were not the stones. A steward came to speak of schedules and pairings, of sponsors and expectations. He wore a tunic too fine for basements and an expression too practiced for sincerity. "The crowd enjoys a narrative," he said, as if he were explaining weather to sailors. "Love them, and they may love you. Defy them, and you must do it beautifully. Do not bore them. No one survives boredom."
Maximilianus took the measure of the room, the width of the door, the distance to the water bucket, the place where the light from the grate above carved a square on the floor large enough to be a prayer rug. He sat in the square and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, the vineyard returned not in flames, but as it had been. Vines shouldering their green faithfully along wires, soil red as a good secret, a boy running and then pretending he had not run when called to help with the baskets. He did not chase the vision. He let it sit beside him, an old friend who would not speak first. The morning of their first show arrived on cat feet. Armor was issued. Leather made to look like heavier virtue, metal polished to catch a sun that was still deciding how much to involve itself. A young attendant, steady-fingered, strapped Maximilianus's greaves. "Breathe," the boy said, because someone older had told him this helps. Maximilianus smiled without showing teeth. It turned the boy into a person instead of a task, and both felt better. Before they went up, the old gladiator gathered them with a glance rather than a call. He whispered, "Remember what we said about marks. Remember the tide. And, if you can manage it, remember to look up once. Let the sky see you." The gate rose. Light arrived like a verdict, and then softened when it saw how calmly the men received it. Sand took their steps and handed them back in little edits. The roar was not a lion, it was a sea greeting its shoreline routine. Maximilianus did as he had done in 100 true fields. He measured, he listened, he placed his feet as though the earth were a partner. Across from him, a man raised a net with professional grace, the trident held not as threat, but as proof of employment. They circled. The crowd leaned forward with its 1,000 heads to see which sentence would be written. What passed between the two men was less a duel than a conversation conducted in an older grammar. Feint, reply. Offer, refusal. Pause, courtesy. When the net flew, Maximilianus did not frighten it. He stepped aside and returned it to its owner with an economy that made a few spectators laugh in that relieved way crowds laugh when shown a thing done correctly. When the trident came low, he let the haft find his shield and let his shield teach it manners. When his turn came to answer, he chose a line that ended in dignity rather than humiliation. The old man with the broom, somewhere under the arches, nodded once, tiny and satisfied. By the time the horn called a halt, nothing sensational had occurred, and yet something generous had.
The crowd, surprised to find itself entertained by restraint, applauded with the sincere palms of people grateful for craft. The steward would later call this building a brand. The men called it living.
Back in the Undercroft, hearts slowed. A water jar met many mouths and held no grudges. Someone made a joke about the net's pride. Someone else, the sparrow of a man, sang 2 lines of a song about a hill and time and stopped before the third, as if to leave room for longing. Maximilianus cleaned the edge of his blade, not because it required it, but because care is a way to keep the hands from going where the mind should not. Outside, Rome rehearsed its day. Vendors argued politely with success. Senators prepared their facial expressions for debate. The sun turned corners of columns into lit pages, and beneath the stone, in a square of light that moved as the hour moved, a man once called general, and now called whatever the roster required, closed his eyes and practiced remembering what should be remembered and forgetting what could only harm the remembering. He slept a little, not because he was safe, but because sleep, when permitted, is a kind of rebellion. In that sleep, he walked between rows of vines that had forgiven the fire by growing again in the only direction they know. At the end of the row stood no empire, no emperor, only a doorway with a child's laughter behind it and the patience of a woman formed of earth and weather. He reached for the latch and awoke before touching it, content to have delayed the gesture by a breath he had chosen. The sand would call again. The tide would test him. The city would learn his silhouette and begin to attach expectations to it. But for now, in the first quiet after the first noise, Maximilianus had descended as far as any man need descend to begin the long work of rising. Morning entered the amphitheater like a careful guest, laying pale light on the upper arches first, then letting it spill across tier upon tier until the sand below wore a soft gold. The city arrived in waves, vendors with baskets of figs, citizens in white that caught the sun like small sails, boys darting through legs with the confidence of water. Trumpets spoke only enough to confirm the hour. Everything else was the murmur of a hive waking to sweetness. Below, where oil and iron share the air, Maximilianus prepared the way a farmer prepares a field, with attention to small things. The strap that had loosened yesterday received a new hole and a promise. The edge of the blade, already honest, was given another minute of respect. Leather met skin and agreed to cooperate. He breathed in counts that never changed, not for emperors, not for crowds, not for the voice inside that sometimes asked for news of vineyards. The steward read the day's pairings as a priest reads a calendar of saints. Names gathered upon names, each with a small story attached. Fast hands, good footwork, poor temper, loved by the west side of the crowd, mocked by the east. When Maximilianus's turn came, there was no flourish. Opening pass, with the netman again. Build. The word did not seek glory, it sought continuity. They entered to a roar that behaved itself. Sun glanced from helmets as if approving the industry. Across the sand, the netman lifted his tool with the theatrical economy of a craftsman who knows that overstatement wastes breath. Maximilianus lifted his shield and let it be a conversation starter. The first exchange repeated yesterday's lesson: offer, refusal, threat, courtesy, so that the audience could lean into familiarity. The second shifted a degree. When the net flew, Maximilianus cut through one strand, not enough to humiliate, enough to demonstrate wit. Laughter opened like a fan. The netman grinned behind his mask and returned the favor with a feint that tapped Maximilianus on the knee as lightly as a teacher's knuckle on a desk. The horn called the halt. Applause gathered itself, surprised again to find pleasure in restraint. Back below, the old gladiator said nothing, which was the loudest praise he owned. The steward, counting coins with eyes alone, allowed himself a satisfied purse of the mouth. "They're learning your sentence," he murmured. "Keep writing it." Days braided into a rope sturdy enough to climb. The matches lengthened, opponents changed, a Murmillo with a shield like a door, patient as a winter, a light-footed Thracian whose blade preferred curves to edges, a towering secutor who believed he could convince the crowd with volume. Each time, Maximilianus chose a different honesty. Against the door, he became hinge. Against the dancer, he became metronome. Against the tower, he shifted his weight until the tower became tired of being tall. Sand accepted each footprint and returned it edited. Word, which is always like to travel, moved through Rome. There was a man who fought as if fighting were not a spectacle, but a form of craftsmanship, whose mercy, when permitted by the rule of the moment, looked less like weakness and more like memory, whose gaze never begged the crowd and never insulted it. Vendors learned his silhouette so they could call figs and bread at the right time. Children practiced his half-step in alleys and called the game tide. Women who understood sorrow watched with a seriousness that had nothing to do with blood. He began to acquire the smallest of relics, a sprig of thyme tossed from a high seat and retrieved without theater. A strip of blue cloth used to wrap a wrist, returned to the owner later at the gate with a nod. A shallow dent in his shield that fit his thumb exactly and reminded him to be patient. He kept none of these as trophies. He let them pass through his hands in the evening like beads in prayer, then gave them back to the day. Not every bout could end in courtesy. There were mornings when the schedule made cruelty a requirement written in a font too large to ignore. On such days, Maximilianus took life with a quiet that taught even those who came for noise to lower their voices. He knelt when it was over, always, and pressed his hand to the sand, as if to ask the ground to hold what he could not. The crowd learned, without being instructed, to applaud with palms that remembered the weight of bread. In the corridors between shows lives a different city. Sponsoring nobles drifted like fragrances, choosing protégés the way a child chooses a shell. Shiny, perhaps, loud. One of them stopped before Maximilianus, trailing sentences about advancement, favor, the possibility of being moved from the undercard to the hour that sells stories by the amphora. Maximilianus listened with the courtesy due a person, and declined with the courtesy due himself. The noble blinked, unused to men whose price is not a coin. There were markers of assent. The first wreath, palm leaves bound with a thread so thin it seemed shy, placed upon his forearm instead of his head, because he bowed at the wrong time and made the crowd laugh. The laugh turned affectionate. The first poster sketched in charcoal on a tavern wall, a figure only vaguely him, but with a stance so accurate he had to look away. The first chant, borne by 3 voices and returned by 30, then 300, then an upper ring that prided itself on not chanting at all.
He did not drink the sound, he let it pass over him like morning air. He met the city's other gladiators not only in the ring. In the infirmary, a Gaul with shoulders like the gates of a field offered him a cup while a physician stitched. "You move like someone who has already been forgiven," the Gaul said. Maximilianus, wincing as the needle made its case, answered, "I move like someone who remembers a door." The Gaul tilted his head. "Then perhaps you should teach my feet Latin."
On a day vellum sails were unfurled above to temper a ferocious sun, a new opponent was announced, a veteran promoted to main cards, known for finishing bouts with the clean punctuation that crowds respect because it spares them the mess of ambivalence. The two men saluted, touched shields, and began. The veteran pressed immediately, economy personified, no waste, no theater, a grammar tight enough to cut. Maximilianus accepted the pace, then declined the premise. He lengthened the space between actions by half a heartbeat, made room where no room had been scheduled. A feint became a question, an answer became a promise. The veteran recognized the invitation and smiled inside his helm. His shoulders lowered a finger width, which made him more dangerous and also more beautiful. For 10 minutes, the ring held not a fight, but an essay on balance. When the conclusion presented itself, it did not shout. A slip, a check, a turn, a tap that could have been worse and was not. The horn, when it sounded relieved. The crowd stood because it had seen something meticulous. The veteran, breathing steadily, touched Maximilianus's helm with 2 fingers, the old soldier's benediction. Below, the steward actually clapped twice, like a man dropping 2 coins into a jar he had not expected to find. "This," he said to anyone listening, which was no one and everyone, "is the trick. They come for blood and leave discussing form." That evening, as the city folded itself into dinners and debates, Maximilianus sat with his back to a pillar, where a square of late light made a homeland on the floor. He unwrapped the small bandage at his forearm and changed it without fuss. The old gladiator settled beside him, bones narrating their complaints. "You are rising," he said, as if reporting weather. "The air is thinner up there. Breathe slower." "Breath is all I own," Maximilianus replied. "Not all," the old man said, and looked at the lintel as though it too might offer counsel. "There is also what you refuse to sell." The next festival crowned the rise with a pageant. Foreign beasts were displayed to remind Romans of the size of their world. Actors in painted masks reenacted the founding of the city with a comic timing that even gods would have envied. At the center of it, a sequence of matches told a tidy story the steward had written in his head, a newcomer who would stumble, then recover, then triumph, thus giving the crowd the comfort of inevitability. But inevitability is a lazy god. The newcomer stumbled and did not recover. The second man, the villain, wept privately afterward and gave half his purse to the widower of the first. Maximilianus watched and learned again the limits of scripts. When his turn came, final bout before the chariot race, he found himself opposite a man whose eyes held the brightness of someone with nothing left to protect. The pairing had been cruel in its arithmetic. Maximilianus adjusted the math. He made every exchange a little softer than it could have been, every opportunity for harm into a lesson about proximity. The crowd murmured at first, then understood. At the end, when the horn implied a question with its length, he stepped back, lowered his blade, and offered the other man his life in the shape of a choice. The man, whose chest rose like a hill after a long winter, nodded. The editor of the games lifted his thumb sideways, a compromise rarely given and well received. The amphitheater exhaled. Somewhere in the fourth tier,
A woman began to cry, as if the city had finally remembered an old promise.
Popularity is a tide. It lifts and complicates. Messages arrived wrapped in silk, then in humbler cloth tied with true knots. A boy was paid to shout his name on market days. A baker traced his profile in flour upon a round and sold bread that bore the rumor of his face. He never went to claim any of it. He walked the smaller streets at dusk, counting fountains, translating birdsong, touching, when no one watched, the old stones as one touches a shoulder in passing. At last, the name reached ears that wear laurel even in private. The emperor's son, now emperor in every way marble can affirm, heard the city's hum and asked for its source. When told, he smiled the way a blade smiles when polished. "A soldier," he said. "How novel." He asked for a special day to be arranged, a spectacle under his gaze, a demonstration of how the world obeys when greatness attends. The order went down like a stone tossed into a deep cistern. Splash, ring, ring, ring. Each ring becoming someone's task, someone's fear, someone's rhetorical flourish. The steward bowed to the messengers and to his own reflection. The old gladiator sat longer than usual on his bench that night, and, when the lamps were snuffed, put a hand on Maximilianus's shoulder as one might tie a small knot in a thread to mark the place. "Breathe slower," he said again. Maximilianus slept, and the sleep was not kind and not unkind, merely what sleep is to men who must stand in a large room tomorrow, a rehearsal of walking, of placing feet, of remembering where the door is even when the door is made of light.
The city woke, hungry for pageant. Purple draped the imperial box like a bruise made beautiful. Trumpets discovered their louder voices. The vellum did its patient work of turning murderous sun into manageable glow. In the cells, attendants made last-minute ministrations that were also kindnesses. A boy adjusted a strap and whispered, "Come back." It was not an order. It was the kind of prayer that trusts the road because you have walked it together once before. The gate lifted. Sand and sky and sound opened. Maximilianus stepped into the arena. He had already learned how to read, and Rome, arranged in its perfect circle, leaned forward to listen to whatever story his breath would make next.
The day appointed for splendor arrived, with the careful ceremony of a procession. Gates flung their tall shadows across marble. Vendors rehearsed the cadence of their calls, and the city's breath gathered itself into one great rising inhale. Purple hung from the imperial box like a bruise turned to fashion. Above, the vast awning made a soft ocean of shade, its ropes humming a low music to the wind. The amphitheater, stone hive of appetite and awe, glowed as if someone had set daylight upon a careful dimmer. Below, where oil and iron keep their counsel, attendants moved among men like quiet bees. Leather straps were cinched and re-cinched. Buckles remembered their jobs. Blades were wiped until they forgot where they had been. A boy with steady hands adjusted the last loop on Maximilianus's cuirass and whispered, because whispers are the only currency that spends in such rooms, "Come back." He nodded, not promising anything, only agreeing to carry the request. The steward appeared with a tablet and a voice that had practiced importance. "Orders from above," he said to the room and to his reflection. "Sequence revised. The soldier," a glance toward Maximilianus that tried to be casual and failed,
We'll close the morning with a demonstration of form. The emperor desires excellence. Desire in palaces is a weather system. It presses down on far roofs. The trainers exchanged looks, measured in grains of sand. The old gladiator, bones like careful hinges, eyes like patient tools, rested a hand on Maximilianus and let it be speech. "Breathe slower," he said again, as if reminding a tide how to go about its work.
Trumpets silvered the air. 100 small noises climbed the stone. Laughter spilling from a high tier, the creak of a fruit seller's yoke, the clap of two friends renewing a promise to meet after. Then the horn that belongs to the floor beneath all floors, the signal that turns preparation into presence. The gate lifted like a polite eyelid. Light arrived, considered the men, and softened its stare. Maximilianus stepped into day. Sand took his weight and edited it with kindness. Even from the far seats he was a plain figure, no gilded helmet, no theatrical plume, yet a murmur followed him, the recognition that attends those who do the difficult thing without announcing it. Across from him waited the first sentence in the emperor's paragraph, a secator, tall and methodical, shield like a door, sword like a law. They closed the distance, the roar tilted forward and then held, as if Rome herself wanted to hear the thoughts of steel. The secator tested him, straight lines, heavy punctuation. Maximilianus declined to be a wall. He became hinge. When weight came, he gave it a place to go. When the blade sought argument, he offered grammar. A turn, a check, the small correction that spares a crowd its worst desires. The horn sounded its short approval. The secator touched his shield to Maximilianus and left with his dignity folded neatly under his arm. The audience applauded with palms that knew bread from spectacle. The second opponent came on a different music, a Thracian with a crescent blade that preferred curves to conclusions. He danced his questions. Maximilianus answered with meter. Where the blade sought to sketch, the shield supplied margin. Where the feet braided invention, he unbraided it, one strand at a time. When a finishing shape presented itself, he declined it with the restraint of someone who understands that the most beautiful line is sometimes the one not drawn. The horn, pleased to be wise, spared both, and the amphitheater hummed a lower note, the sound people make when their hearts are being taught without their permission. A third figure entered, net and trident, the fishermen of men. The crowd chuckled at the remembered pairing. In their first exchange, Maximilianus nicked the net again, only a thread, only a suggestion, and offered it back with a sweep that said, "We know each other. Let us be artisans together." The netman, grateful, made a flourish so modest it felt like a bow. Laughter opened like a fan. Gratitude followed it, more private. Word climbed stone like ivy. The emperor smiles. He did. Seated in a box that was a theater within the theater, a man who had practiced being history since childhood and never quite learned how to be anything else. When he smiled, those near him smiled, and when his fingers tapped a rhythm, lesser hearts borrowed the tempo. He was handsomely armored in approval, and watched the floor with the gaze of a boy who had been denied a father's last benediction and now sought substitute rights. He leaned to the editor of the games and murmured a request that sounded like a compliment and behaved like a knife. The editor bowed in a curve that had been rehearsed before a mirror and sent a runner down the throat of the building.
The next pairing was not customary. Two men came at once, light and loud, blades borrowed from a myth that had never respected physics. The crowd sat forward. This was the kind of simple arithmetic it understood. 2 is more than 1. On the sand, Maximilianus changed his book. He narrowed the world to breath and feet, made the first man hurry into emptiness and the second man slow into doubt. A touch to a wrist, a nudge to a knee, small edits that turned danger into sentence structure. When an opening yawned, he walked around it as one walks around a well in the dark, respectfully. The two found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder, chests lifting in the synchronized humility of men who have discovered their limits. The horn, astonished by its own mercy, agreed to end the paragraph there. The emperor's fingers ceased tapping. A hush gathered, not silence, but a crowd's way of making a bowl for the next sound. Into that bowl, the editor poured an old cruelty, an animal brought to prove Rome's power over everything that breathes. The gate opposite rose. A cat, a foreign sun padded into view, not hungry exactly, only confused by noise and the memory of trees. Its coat was a burned gold. Its eyes were lessons about light.
Maximilianus lowered his blade by a finger's width and let the audience see him breathe. He turned his body to seem larger to the cat, as shepherds do when wolves mismeasure their chances. He spoke, not in words the upper tiers could hear, but in the language of muscles that refused to lie. When the cat circled, he circled too, allowing the distance to be mutual. The editor shifted in his chair like a man sitting on a stone. The emperor's smile thinned. A handler, following orders shaped like flattery, loosed a second beast with a gesture that felt like a cheer. Two suns now moved on the sand, intersecting ellipses of instinct. Maximilianus stepped into their geometry and erased his edges until even the animals decided he was a part of the weather. When the nearer cap fainted, he let the faint be enough. When the farther cat paused to taste the air, he let the pause be the answer. Minutes became a kind of prayer. At last, a horn, embarrassed by how long it had taken to find wisdom, sounded the reprieve that men with ropes had been longing to hear. The beasts departed the way storms depart, backwards, still complaining. The crowd exhaled the long exhale that turns a spectacle into a self-respect. The emperor rose. The city rose with him, because that is what cities do when asked by the tallest chair. He descended, not to the sand, but to the lip where shadow and light negotiate. An officer, polished, careful, guided a voice down to the floor. "Remove your helm. The ruler desires to see the face of Rome's favorite artisan."
The request was shaped like honor and carried the scent of a trap. In the undercroft, the old gladiator closed his eyes, as if lending a breath across distance. Maximilianus stood as men stand when doors present themselves. He considered the helm, the little world it had been, the privacy it granted, the choices it deferred. He lifted it off with the slow economy of someone sending a message to a time beyond the present. Light found his features, mapped the lines drawn by campaigns and seasons and grief. For a heartbeat, the amphitheater forgot how to be many and knew itself as one. It remembered him. Not the crafted figure on tavern walls, not the rumor drawn in flour on bread, but the outline that once led legions through forests where breath smokes and earth drinks Sabbathless rain. Recognition moved like a spark through straw. The Emperor's face altered. Not a flinch, not a collapse, but the small adjustment a mirror makes when a window opens. He had known, perhaps. Suspicion is a hobby of power. Knowing is different from seeing. He smiled again, wider now, thinner too. "General," he said, but not to be heard by all. The word walked a line between greeting and accusation. Maximilianus did not bow. He met the elevated gaze with the surface of a calm lake. Had language been demanded, he might have shaped something like, "I was a servant of Rome. Now I am a servant of this moment." He let the unsaid do its work. In the upper tiers, old veterans placed hands upon the edges of their seats and remembered commands that had made sense. In the lower rows, children, who have not learned to be afraid of history, began to chant the new sound of an old name.
The Emperor, who had spent a lifetime choreographing applause, felt a different music pushing at his ribs. He replaced his smile with a studied neutrality and lifted his palm to bless what he could not yet forbid. "A match fitting the hour," he declared, voice shaped for corridors more than sand. "An exhibition to honor skill." Exhibition. The word walked down through ranks of officials and arrived in a steward's ear as instruction. Make it crown-like, without permitting a coronation. The arrangement that followed would be recorded as entertainment and remembered as a test. Armed men of reputable experience, staged not as ambush, but as honor guard. 4, then 6, then 8, each to enter as a new clause in a sentence that wanted to end the way power likes endings to go. They came in pairs, respectful in the way professionals are respectful when the job asks them to forget they are men. Maximilianus received them the way water receives stone, giving place, finding edges, teaching weight to become shape. 2, he turned with foot and shield until they faced each other and discovered cooperation. 2 more, he taught patience by the beautiful inconvenience of not being where their blades expected him to be. When harm was unavoidable, he made it clean. When mercy was possible, he made it inevitable. The arena, which had been trained to hunger, learned to admire. Admiration is heavier. It does not leave the throat so quickly.
At 8, someone near the Emperor coughed a suggestion that sounded like victory. The Emperor tasted it and found it insufficient. He raised a finger. A 9th entered, older, scarred, carrying the deliberation of a man who knew the price of everything that glittered under sun. They met in the middle and let time thin. 3 exchanges like call and response in an ancient hymn. On the 4th, Maximilianus found the angle that was not a wound but a persuasion. The older man yielded, not humiliated, but convinced. He saluted with 2 fingers laid to his helm, the old benediction again, and left the sand to younger knees. The amphitheater did something rare then. It was quiet, not with boredom, not with fear, with respect. In that bowl of silence, the Emperor's heart made a private noise that frightened him. He covered it with approval, the way a spill is covered with a rug, and performed generosity. "Rome is pleased," he announced. The words were true, and also a bandage. Maximilianus stood in the center of the world's eye and allowed the chant to pour over him without entering him. He raised his blade, not high, only enough to acknowledge that the many had chosen to be one for a minute. Then he lowered it and let the horn have the last word. Back in the undercroft, air returned to its usual shape. Men who had watched from grates and cracks in doors nodded in the language of those who cannot afford adjectives. The boy unbuckled the last strap with fingers that shook a little and then stilled. The old gladiator set his broom aside, and leaned his head against the cool wall, smiling the smile of a craftsman who has just seen a perfect joint come flush without being forced. "He saw you," he said softly.
"He saw what he made," Maximilianus answered, tying a small knot in the edge of his bandage and leaving the tail long. "Now he will decide what to do with it." Above, the emperor let attendants gather his purple into obedient folds. He stared at the sand which had so recently obeyed him, and found it less certain. A plan began to assemble in his mind, all straight lines and tidy endings. Plans like that love themselves more than they love truth. He dismissed no one, and dismissed everyone, the way men do when they wish to be alone with their better-looking thoughts. Rome emptied by degrees, its appetite sated, its admiration startled into decency. In taverns, talk took its first steps toward legend. On balconies, women watered vines and said nothing, which is a kind of vote. Children lay on roofs and mouthed the movements of feet they had watched, trying to keep them for later. Night came to fold its cool cloth over the city's warm brow. In his cell, Maximilianus sat in the square of light that fell from the grate and listened to the breath of sleeping men, the truest chorus Rome has. He placed one palm upon the ground, as if to feel the slow turning of a world that must carry both laurel and loss. Somewhere beyond stone and law and rumor, a memory of wheat fields exhaled, and the heart, doing the only work it can do, kept time. The emperor, in chambers lined with cedar and choices, did not sleep quickly. He turned the day over and found in its underside the face of a man he had tried to erase. He smiled at mirrors until they agreed to mirror him again. Before his lamp he placed a small statue of Mars, as boys do when they want their fathers to be brave on their behalf. Plans stacked themselves neatly upon the table. Tomorrow would be arranged. But plans are loud, and the gods, when they choose, prefer whispers.
The days that followed were days of tension disguised as routine. Rome continued to breathe. Markets thrummed with chatter. Senators rehearsed speeches that meant less than the handshakes traded in the shadows. Children played in alleys with stones that stood in for swords. But beneath the marble and noise, a pulse quickened. The amphitheater would host a spectacle greater than any festival, one shaped not by tradition, but by the emperor's will. Word spread, as word always does, clothed in rumor but carried by certainty. The emperor himself would preside over a contest designed to prove Rome's strength and silence whispers. At the heart of it, the name on every lip, the chant on every street corner, the figure scratched into tavern tables and flour-dusted loaves, Maximilianus. The steward read the decree with a voice rehearsed for importance. The games would not be ordinary. They would be the climax of a season, an offering to the gods, a hymn to Rome's eternity. Behind the flourish of words was a simple intent: to break a man before the eyes of all. In the undercroft,
where torches painted shadows on stone, Maximilianus sat among his companions. The old gladiator swept sand from a corner, his broom whispering as if reluctant to disturb the silence. "This is not a match," he said at last. "It is a verdict already written." Maximilianus looked at his hands, scarred maps of duty, and replied softly, "All verdicts are written. Some are read aloud, some are carried quietly to the grave. It is not the verdict that matters, but the manner of carrying." That night he did not dream of blood or sand. He dreamed of his vineyard, though he no longer saw flames there. The vines had grown back, green and obedient to the sun, forgiving the fire that had once consumed them. In the distance, a boy laughed, the sound traveling over the fields like bird-song. He woke with a calm that was not the absence of fear, but the recognition of its shape.
The city awoke with anticipation, thick as incense. Crowds poured into the amphitheater until the stone itself seemed to hum with the weight of humanity. Trumpets sounded, drums beat like the pulse of a giant heart. Purple banners hung heavy from the imperial box, each fold declaring the emperor's dominion. Below, in the cool corridors, armor was strapped with deliberate care. A boy adjusted Maximilianus's greaves, his hands trembling less now, as though hope had steadied them. "You will come back," he whispered again, but this time it sounded less like a plea and more like belief. The old gladiator placed a hand on Maximilianus's shoulder one final time. "Remember," he said, "the crowd is a tide. Let it carry you, but do not drown in it." The gate creaked open. Light rushed in like a river, dazzling, merciless. Maximilianus stepped into it, his shadow stretching long across the sand. The roar rose, tier upon tier, a sound too vast to belong to mortals. Names were shouted, chants overlapping, until they became one continuous hymn, not of emperor, not of senate, but of a man who had carried himself with honor. They came not one by one, but in orchestrated waves. First, 2 murmilloes, shields like walls, swords eager for punctuation. Maximilianus moved with patience, letting them press, letting them reveal the rhythm of their training. A turn, a check, a subtle redirection. Soon they were facing each other, bewildered. The crowd laughed, applauded. The horn spared them both. Next came 4 Thracians, light-footed, blades curving like question marks. They circled, they darted, they wove patterns of threat. Maximilianus became the steady point at the center of their storm, his steps small, his breath unhurried. He allowed them to exhaust their invention until their movements lost sharpness. With gentle precision, he disarmed one, turned another aside, and when the horn called, all 4 still lived. The audience roared, not for blood, but for form. Then came beasts, as Rome loved to display. A lion and a panther, loosed together. The crowd leaned forward, eager for carnage. But Maximilianus did not lift his blade.
He widened himself, breathed slow, met their eyes not with challenge, but with presence. The animals circled, confused, their instincts blunted by the calm before them. The horn, impatient, sounded the recall. The animals retreated, and a murmur spread through the amphitheater like a question that had not been asked before.
From the imperial box, the emperor watched, his smile thin as a blade's edge. Each mercy granted, each dignity preserved, struck him like a wound. This was not the narrative he had written. He desired humiliation. The crowd was receiving reverence. He rose, purple robes catching the sun, and the city rose with him. His voice carried like a decree carved in marble. Rome honors skill, yet Rome also demands conclusion. Let the general face Rome's justice. The words fell into the sand like stones. The gate opposite opened. From it emerged not another gladiator, not a beast, but the emperor himself, armored in gold that gleamed too brightly, flanked by guards who halted at the threshold. Gasps rippled through the amphitheater. Never had emperor entered the sand. Maximilianus stood still. He felt the weight of thousands of eyes, the pressure of history arranging itself. The emperor approached, sword drawn, smile sharp. "Do you see, General?" he said, voice low enough for only a few to hear. "Rome bends to me. Today it will watch you fall, and in your fall it will see my eternity."
The horn sounded. The emperor struck first, blade flashing with practiced fury. Maximilianus met the blow not with force, but with control, turning it aside, stepping back, letting the younger man burn his strength. Strike after strike fell, each met with calm defense, each parried as one parries the tantrum of a storm. The crowd, expecting spectacle, found itself holding its breath. They saw not two men, but two Romes, one built on hunger, the other on honor. At last, Maximilianus countered, not to wound, but to teach. His blade traced a line along the emperor's arm, shallow but undeniable. Gasps echoed. Blood, bright against gold, spoke louder than any herald. The emperor staggered, rage boiling into desperation. He lunged, wild, unmeasured. Maximilianus stepped aside, his sword at the man's throat in a gesture that could have ended everything. Silence fell. The entire city seemed to wait. Maximilianus looked into the emperor's eyes and saw not power, but a frightened child clutching at shadows. He lowered his blade. Mercy once again. But mercy is dangerous in the company of pride. The emperor, seizing the moment, thrust forward, blade scraping Maximilianus's side. The wound was real, deep. He stumbled, his breath a harsh wind. The crowd cried out, torn between horror and devotion. Summoning the last of his strength, Maximilianus drove forward, not with hatred, but with inevitability. His blade entered clean, precise. The emperor's eyes widened, the gold of his armor catching the sun as if mocking him. He collapsed into the sand, crownless, defeated not by rage, but by the man he had tried to erase. Maximilianus fell to his knees, the wound in his side stealing his breath. The crowd thundered, not in triumph, but in grief and reverence. Old veterans saluted, women wept openly,
Children chanted his name as if it were a prayer. He looked upward to the slice of sky above the amphitheater. In the blue, he saw vineyards stretching, wheat fields swaying, a boy's laughter carried by wind. His lips curved into the faintest smile. He pressed his hand into the sand, as he always had, and whispered, "Home." Then he lay back, eyes closing, the roar of Rome fading into silence. The crowd rose as one, honoring not emperor, not spectacle, but a man who had carried dignity into death. His body was born from the sand, not as a slave, not as a gladiator, but as Rome's last true general. And in the centuries to follow, when stones crumbled and empires fell, the whispers of Maximilianus still lingered in the corridors of the Colosseum, a tide that refused to ebb.
Morning came to Rome with the gentleness that follows a storm. The amphitheater, which had roared itself hoarse, now wore a hush like a sacred garment. Workers dragged the rake across the sand, smoothing the record of feet and fury into a blank, as if to grant the earth itself a small mercy. Above, the awnings breathed in the light breeze. Swallows stitched the pale sky with their quick, dark notes. Rome, so practiced at forgetting, paused instead to remember. Word traveled along colonnades and market stalls, through bathhouses and barracks, along the Tiber and up the 7 hills. The emperor had fallen on the sand he thought he owned. The gladiator who would not bow had lain back and closed his eyes as if finally permitted to sleep. The city's hum changed key. Vendors sold their figs more quietly. The barber's jokes came later in the day than usual. Even the moneylenders counted coin with a softer knuckle. Grief does not cancel commerce in Rome, it slows its wrist. In the Undercroft, where the torch smoke always lingered like old advice, men who had shared oil and water with Maximilianus sat shoulder to shoulder and allowed silence to speak for them. The old gladiator rested both hands on the broom as though on a staff, and looked at the square of light that crept across the floor each morning. He walked straight, he said at last. No flourish. Those who heard understood it as the highest praise.
The boy who had buckled straps and whispered small prayers carried away a strip of linen that had bound Maximilianus's forearm. He did not keep it as a relic to be shown. He folded it into his belt as a reminder of how to use hands. Steady, honest, and without asking for applause. An edict came quickly. Orders always hurry to arrive before truth has time to seat itself. The Senate, which had survived greater convulsions than the rise and fall of one ruler, declared stability. There would be mourning for an emperor, and in a gesture the city recognized as a new wind, honors for the man whose death had unmade him. A funeral procession was arranged. Not imperial, nothing gilded, no hired grief, but a civic rite that allowed cobblestones and feet upon them to say what could not be carved with sufficient accuracy into stone. They bore Maximilianus on a bier lined in plain cloth. Laurel touched his brow not as a conqueror's crown, but as a wreath gathered from a hillside where boys play. Veterans walked with the peculiar posture of men remembering orders that no longer need giving. Women laid olive branches upon the path with the steady hands of those who have always kept a house standing when the men were away. Children, who understand tithes better than statutes, fell into the procession's rhythm,
and learned the first lesson of legacy. It is a movement, not a monument.
They took him past the places that had made his name ordinary, the market where a baker had once scored a loaf with a silhouette, the fountain where the sparrow-lean man had stopped his song on the second line, the arch that had learned to shade him without preference. At the field of Mars, where Rome stores its memories of breath and blade, the buyer paused. A tribune too old for politics and too young for death's complete instruction stepped forward and spoke, not long, not loud. "He returned our mirror," he said. "We will try to keep what we saw." When Earth took him, it did so with the quiet competence that always shames human ceremony. A handful of soil fell from the old gladiator's palm and struck the coffin's lid with a soft percussion. Another handful followed, a rhythm like the beginning of rain. "Rest," the old man said, and the word, having worked many trades in its life, took up once more the task of shelter.
Legends usually lengthen in the telling. This one simplified. Taverns tried, for a week or two, to attach inventions, a secret cadre of nobles, a whispered prophecy, an invisible hand of gods. The inventions did not take. What endured was plainer, and therefore more usable. A general who remembered he was a man. A slave who remembered he was free in the only way freedom can be guaranteed, from the inside out. Children began a game in the alleys. One would stand in the center and be the tide. The others would move like boats, learning to feel the lift and settle of breath. They called the game Max. Mothers smiled to hear a hard name made friendly. But when the children asked what it meant, the mothers answered with simple grammar: to hold steady. A baker, whose bread tasted faintly of anise and old stories, placed once a week and without a sign an unpriced loaf on the sill for anyone needing it. He scored the crust with a single long line. When asked, he shrugged. Some lines should not be broken, he said.
In the school beneath the desert, where men are remade until a crowd learns to recognize them, the broom leaned longer against the wall. The old gladiator taught beginners that day as he had taught the day before, but when the drill ended, he added one extra exercise. "Stand," he said, as if the sky were reading you. They stood, clumsy at first. He nudged a shoulder here, a foot there. "Good," he said. "Now breathe slower." A few smiled, and one or two understood that this was a sacrament in disguise. The boy who had buckled the straps? He grew into a man the city hardly noticed, which is to say, he did well. In time, when he had sons of his own, he did not tell them a story about blood and glory. He showed them how to tie a knot that would hold under strain and how to unfasten it without anger. There was a man, he would say, on summer evenings, when the heat made even stone charitable, who remembered the door.
Far from the marble and noise, in a corner of the countryside where roads stopped insisting on themselves and allowed grass to argue its case, a vineyard grew back. This is what vines do when grief stops telling them what they are. New shoots found the wire. Leaves arrange their green like songs that do not need rehearsing. The woman who had once walked that soil with the man who smelled of iron and evening stood at the edge of a row and let her hand learn again the weight of harvest. She did not ask the sky questions it could not answer. She listened to the bees, which always know what to do next. A neighbor who had given water when flames came, gave seed when spring came.
That is the arithmetic of decent places. A boy, older now, ran the length of the row and pretended not to have run when called to help. On certain days, when the light slanted in the old way, the shadow of a figure in armor would appear across the path, tall and familiar. It was only a trick of branches and longing. It was also real enough for gratitude. They carried no banners there. They hung no portraits. They practiced the modest heroism of harvest and shelter. When a stranger asked if this was the farm of Maximilianus, the woman would wipe her hands on her apron and say, "It is the farm of those who remember him." The stranger, if he had any sense, he would lower his voice.
Rome has never been a careful steward of its own heart. It keeps ledgers more assiduously than promises. And yet, every few generations, a story seeps between the stones and teaches them tenderness. Maximilianus's name did that. It became not a password to tavern talk, but a standard of measurement. Senators would rise and say, "In the spirit of Maximilianus," and be mocked if their next sentence did not behave accordingly. Captains would remind recruits that a shield is a house, not a hammer. Physicians, binding a wound, would murmur, "Clean," thinking of a blade that never made a mess of necessity. The amphitheater, that stone ear that listens to centuries, learned a new echo. Tourists, Rome has always had them, would run their palms along the railing's cool edge and ask guides for imperial gossip. The best guides, the ones worth the second coin, would lead them down a corridor where drafts speak and say, without lowering their voice to drama, "Here." The tourists would look and see only light falling in a rectangle. The good guides would shrug. It's not a painting, it's a verb. On the anniversary, not the emperor's, but the man's, crowds came without decree. They brought nothing institutional, no magistrates, no priests with new rules. A woman hummed the Sparrow Man's unfinished song and for the first time sang the third line. A vet placed his ring upon the sand for 1 minute, then took it back. A child read aloud, haltingly from a tablet on which someone had scratched a short sentence. Mercy is a discipline. A murmur answered, as seas answer when a stone is thrown, rings that go on even after the thrower walks away.
You cannot turn an empire by a single death, but you can place a finger upon its scale. In the months that followed, small laws appeared, the kind that bureaucrats write and poets ignore. Clearer rules for the treatment of prisoners before trial, a limit upon the number of beasts in a single day's display, a stipend for the families of men who fall in the arena when contracts are broken by handlers, not fighters. None of this was redemption. All of it was repair. The city did what it could with the tools it trusted, edicts and habit. In barracks at the edge of the empire, where winters are longer than fingers and men curse the wind with affection, a young centurion pinned above his cot a scrap of cloth with a single straight line inked upon it. When asked, he said only, "It keeps the room honest." Under harsh moons and kinder ones, his cohort learned that orders could be carried with dignity and that speed was no substitute for steadiness unless the wolves were actually coming.
No new emperor is crowned by accident. The next man to wear the purple, less ornate than the last, more attentive to stares, stood before the Senate and spoke briefly. He did not promise golden ages. He promised to sleep at night in a room with the window unlatched so he could hear the noise of the city. "I wish to know," he said, "when Rome is breathing too fast." It was a strange thing to say. A few men laughed for safety, most did not. Later, a scribe recorded that the new ruler, on his first morning, walked the upper ring of the amphitheater the lone before dawn, and placed his hand upon a column, as if one might calculate a pulse that way. The marble, being marble, divulged nothing. The man, being human, felt better for trying.
Years tumbled forward, doing what years do best, rearranging the furniture and calling it progress. The old gladiator's broom found another wall to lean on. The boy became a father, and then, astonishingly, a man whose hair learned winter's grammar. The vineyard harvested itself into habit. The amphitheater crumbled at its edges and defied the crumble at its heart. Rome forgot some things and remembered others. One evening, in a courtyard where a fig tree had decided to be generous, a teacher sat with students too young to have cheered in that year of turmoil. They had heard versions, songs, thin paintings. They wanted the shape of it. "Tell us," one said. The teacher poured water and let the first sip do what first sips do, make room. "There was a man," he began, "who walked as if the sky were reading him. He refused to sell the one thing a man can keep when he has lost everything else, his breath's honesty. He met power and did not imitate it. He met death and did not hurry it."
Was he a hero? A girl asked, testing the word as one tests a rope before trusting it. "He was a worker," the teacher said, "of fields and of forms. The city called him a hero because it does not know how to praise work unless it finds a stage for it." "What did he leave us?" asked another. "A thread," the teacher answered, smiling at how myths talk to one another when unobserved. "Not to find your way out of a maze of stone, but to find your way through days that ask more than they offer. Tie it to what is steady. Walk on. Remember your hand." They sat a while after, not speaking, the way good stories request. When the lamps were lit, moths came to test the edge of fire and were persuaded to keep their distance by the evening's benevolence. Somewhere, as always, Rome negotiated with itself and failed and tried again.
If ever you descend into the guts of that great amphitheater, when tourists have gone and the last guide has balanced his day's coins, you may find a draft walking the corridor, cooled as a hand upon a fevered brow. Follow it. It will lead you to a place where light falls in a tall, thin rectangle. Stand in it. Breathe slower. You will not hear trumpets. You may hear something better. The little noises that make up bravery. A strap being tightened correctly. A blade being cleaned longer than necessary. The measured prayer of feet that will not betray the ground. Place your hand upon the stone. It will not answer. Stones do not. They remember. And if remembering is contagious, as all worthy things are, you will carry away a small contagion, the desire to live in such a way that if the sky should read you, it would nod and go on, relieved to have one less correction to make.
Maximilianus does not need statues. He has the easier monument, a way of walking through the world that others can borrow without owing rent. When you are asked to hurry toward a conclusion that flatters someone else's fear, slow your breath. When you are asked to sell your silence or your noise, keep the kind that steadies other hands. When you are offered spectacle, choose form.
When the crowd is a tide, remember you are not driftwood. And when you lie down, at last, to the sleep that harvests every field, let your last word be not an empire's name, but a home's. The earth will take you. The vines will forgive the flames. A boy will laugh somewhere for reasons having nothing to do with you, and that will be enough. Because legacy is not a throne, it is a door left unlatched so light and air can keep their appointments.